Next up is Jesse Jenkins. Jesse is assistant professor and macro-scale energy system engineer at Princeton University with a joint appointment in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment. He has a very long bio. I'm not going to read it here today, but Jesse has done, we've all been talking about energy transition, how do we get to net zero? He's actually done the analysis and has recommendations of how we get there. So Jesse, I welcome you to the podium.
All right, I'm going to talk about the electricity sector and its role in getting ourselves to cleaner and maintaining reliability in our energy mix. Are there football fans in the audience here? Raise your hands. Anybody? All right, go Tigers. I'm going to talk about the Decarbonization Playbook here, how we're going to get to net zero. And it's actually starting to get quite clear, the steps ahead of us on that path. So let's dig in. Now, I want to start with this, which is important for a conversation here in New Jersey or anywhere else in the country focused primarily on state action and state policy, which is that for the first time in our history, the full financial might of the federal government is now aligned behind a clean energy transition. That is a game changer for all of the conversations we should be having in this room and around the country. New Jersey stepped out and tried to lead on clean energy policy for years. Now, finally, we have the backing of the federal government. And that fundamentally changes the conversation for us here, because what it means is that effectively, we've put, I'll get back to this. We've effectively put clean energy on sale for all of us, including here in the state of New Jersey. All right, we're also going to make significant progress thanks to the passage of federal legislation, chiefly the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law in the last Congress, along our national path to net zero emissions. This is our recent progress. Folks may not know that we actually have been cutting greenhouse gas emissions over the last decade from our peak, which was reached in about 2006 through 2007. Emissions are down about 1 billion metric tons, and we projected at the REPEAT project, which has been assessing the impact of federal policy, that without any new legislation enacted in the last Congress, we would have continued effectively on that same pathway, reducing greenhouse gas emissions nationally by about 2% per year. So reasonable progress. Now, thanks to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Law, we expect that rate of decarbonization will double nationally to roughly 4% per year. That's enough to get us somewhere between 37 and 41% below our peak emissions levels by 2030 and about 50% below our peak emissions levels by 2035. Now, of course, even that is actually lagging behind the pathway that we should be on if we want to hit our national objectives of reaching net zero by 2050 and cutting greenhouse gas emissions to half of our peak levels by 2030. Those are the targets that President Biden has committed the country to on the international stage, and they're consistent with both our moral responsibility and our wealth and technological capabilities to lead the way globally on this path to net zero. So you can see we still have a gap. If you think about it this, effectively we're running about 5 years behind schedule. We hit about 50% below peak levels in 2035 rather than 2030. And because current federal policy effectively lasts through the mid-2030s, with many of these policies expiring around 2032, things sort of peter out after 2035 without any further policy intervention. So this leaves an important role for states like New Jersey to step in and help fill the gap, as well as voluntary leadership by corporations that are stepping up their commitments to drive the transition to cleaner energy sources. And all of those actions are now much easier thanks to these federal laws as well. We don't bake into our analysis any further action at the state level or even at the federal level beyond what's already in the law. But what the federal policies do is put clean energy on sale by offering tax credits, rebates, grants, loans, loan guarantees, et cetera, all of which lower the effective cost of adopting cleaner energy solutions. So for the millions of distributed decisions that you or I make about our households or our businesses, all of those decisions, Uncle Sam is putting their thumb on the scale on the clean side of the ledger. And they're doing that in a way that lowers costs rather than increases it, right? We could have decided to increase the cost of fossil energy to make clean energy relatively more attractive. But instead, what Congress did in this case is offer subsidies of various sorts that make the cleaner energy options cheaper for consumers, households, and businesses around the country. That means that whatever level of action made economic sense for you or I, or for the state of New Jersey, or for a business, before the passage of this law, we can all take greater actions while spending less money. That's important because what we find is that under current legislation, we've modeled the impacts on the PJM electricity marketplace or region where New Jersey is part of, and we expect that without the legislation, emissions were likely to increase on the order of 14% between now and 2035, with costs roughly declining from our current levels by on the order of 30%. So falling costs but increasing emissions was the trajectory prior to the legislation. Now what we see is both declining costs and declining emissions thanks to passage of the Federal Inflation Reduction Act, which again makes all carbon-free electricity sources cheaper, helps to promote energy efficiency and electrification as well. And we estimate that this, without any further state action, will drive down the cost of wholesale or bulk supply costs for electricity, that's generation and transmission, down by about a third by 2035, and reduce our emissions by about 36% below 2021 levels. Now, we could stop there and say, okay, that's great, declining emissions and declining costs. Or we could say, now that everything's cheaper, we're willing to pay a little bit more to go even further. And so this scenario looks at what if all of the states across PJM collectively step up their action and require 80% carbon-free electricity by 2035. And what we found is that we can reduce emissions across PJM on the order of 80 to 90% from our peak levels while paying less than we currently do for electricity consumption today at the bulk level. I want to say that again. We can cut greenhouse gas emissions 80 to 90% from current benchmark levels around 2001 while maintaining system reliability. We model all of those constraints across the grid at a cost comparable to what we pay or less than what we pay today for bulk electricity supply costs. So those challenges that were laid out earlier of maintaining affordability, reliability across the clean energy transition, all three are simultaneously achievable if we follow the Decarbonization Playbook. Now, remember that in 2019, New Jersey committed to a master plan that would get us to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. We updated this analysis after passage of the Inflation Reduction Act at Princeton Zero Lab, that's my group, and we found that New Jersey could step up and get to 100% carbon-free electricity supply now by 2035 rather than 2050, and again, pay bulk electricity supply costs less than we do today, all right? So we can accelerate the timeline, and indeed after our analysis came out, Governor Murphy issued a new executive order committing the state to this target. We still need legislation that would codify that and move us along that direction. All right, so how do we get there? Why am I saying this is all achievable at once? Well, the playbook is actually pretty clear. There are several key ingredients in the play, and they go like this. First, we need to build wind and solar at a record pace. These are now our mainstay, affordable, carbon-free electricity sources that can provide the bulk of our electricity at a very low cost. Second, we have to expand the grid to ready ourselves for electrification and renewables. So we do need to augment our existing electricity grid as electricity takes a larger role of our total energy spending, eating into transportation and industry and heating, and as we tap into the best available renewable resources across the country. We do need to retire our coal-fired power plants. These are the most emitting and in many cases the oldest and most affordable to retire of our existing fossil fuel fleet. The average age of a coal plant is over 45 years in the United States. We can retire these power plants and replace them very effectively with the energy contribution being displaced by wind and solar and the capacity contribution coming by maintaining our existing natural gas power plants and our existing nuclear fleet. What we find in our modeling is on net, we maintain about the same amount of natural gas-fired power capacity across the country as we have today, even as we rapidly retire the remaining 125 gigawatts or so of coal-fired power plants. Now, I say on net because in areas that are more heavily reliant today on coal, we may need new natural gas capacity to maintain reliability while affordably and rapidly transitioning away from coal and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. But in other parts of the country where we have an abundance of gas generation, much of the country overbuilt in the 2000s after deregulation, we actually can retire some of the older, least efficient power plants. And so on net, we have about the same. I anticipate that PJM is one of those regions that will probably need some new gas-fired capacity. Of course, maintaining our existing nuclear power plants should be a priority. We can't run twice as fast to make progress. If we're trying to cut greenhouse gas emissions by reducing our reliance on fossil fuels at the same time that we're trying to displace our existing carbon-free nuclear fleet, we'll have to run twice as fast to make the same amount of progress, and that would be very counterproductive, raising costs for the transition. So we find in our studies, both at the national level and at the PJM level, that these 4 steps alone, these 4 ingredients, scale up renewables, expand our grid, retire coal rapidly, and maintain our existing other firm generation capacity, nuclear and gas, can get us to this 80 to 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. All right. Let's talk a bit more about each of those. The reason that wind and solar are such a central part of the puzzle is that thanks to public policy support driving competition and market deployment that drove scale-up and incremental innovation across the sector, we've seen the cost of wind and solar power plummet over the last decade or so. In fact, the cost of solar and lithium-ion batteries that are not only the main cost component of an EV, but also our growing source of grid-scale battery storage to augment variable renewables, have fallen by about an order of magnitude, right? They're about 90% cheaper than they were a decade ago, right? We did see those costs for solar and batteries go up in real dollar terms for the first time since I started making this chart in 2022. But they have come down again in 2023 as supply chains got unkinked and manufacturing costs continue to fall. So these trajectories are continuing. The cost of wind has fallen by about 2/3 from a decade ago. Those costs went up again a little bit in 2012 and have yet to fall. So we got to keep an eye on those trends. But they're still amongst the most affordable sources of carbon-free electricity that we can use. So what this means is that we have to put the pedal to the metal and deploy as much of these mature and very affordable resources as we can over the next decade. Thanks to previous public policy support, these are now trillion-dollar industries with mature supply chains that are ready for wide-scale deployment, and they're very affordable, meaning the more we deploy, the lower the costs for businesses and consumers in New Jersey and across PJM. But to do that, we're going to have to smash record deployment rates. And this is where things like permitting reform, updating and unkinking interconnection processes at PJM and elsewhere are going to be essential to hit this pace. So this is our historic deployment nationally of all sorts of electricity generation capacity over the last 60, 70 years. You can see the big boom in natural gas generation in the 2000s. That's the gray spike there, where we deployed at a peak 54 gigawatts or 55 gigawatts of gas in a single year. And then you can see the more recent growth of wind in blue and solar in yellow. But this is the modeled pace that we see in a cost-effective pathway to net zero greenhouse gas emissions along the way, hitting that 50% reduction goal in 2030. This requires doubling the peak rate that we've ever achieved for solar and wind deployment on average between now and 2030, and growing that pace to 3.5 times our peak between 2031 and 2035. So again, every year, year in and year out, we should be smashing new record deployment rates at a national scale for these technologies. Now, the good news is that the Energy Information Administration's short-term energy outlook, projecting deployment this year and next year, which is pretty well baked in at this point, shows that solar has already doubled the peak deployment rate. So we're ahead of schedule. We're going to deploy on the order of 35 to 40 gigawatts per year of solar this year and next year. Unfortunately, wind is running at about half of the peak rate over the next couple years, projected to deploy only about 7 gigawatts, down from a peak of 15 gigawatts in 2021. So solar will overcompensate for the wind, but if we want to hit these kinds of rates, we need to get both sectors moving forward at a much more rapid clip. So good news on the solar front, at least. Now, to do all this, we're going to need a much bigger grid, right? Already, just to meet growing electricity demand, to supply our electric vehicles and heat pumps and make hydrogen and do all the other things that we need to do with clean electricity, we're going to see electricity demand begin to grow again for the first time in 30 years or 20 years. Demand nationally has been basically flat since 2005 in the US. It previously grew at about 2.5% per year from the 1970s to the 1990s. We need to get used to those kinds of growth rates again. Our projections are that electricity demand will grow by about 50% by 2035. So similar, 2.5% per year growth rates over the next couple decades. So that alone is going to require a bigger grid, but so is tapping into the best wind and solar resources in the country. Our existing grid was built out largely in that previous era of demand growth from the 30s through the 70s. It tapped into big coal-fired power plants and hydropower plants and other things. That's not necessarily where the best wind and solar resources are, so we're going to have to tap into those American resources also. All of that means we're going to have to build a lot of transmission. Our estimates are that nationally by 2035, we need to add about 75,000 miles of long-distance high-voltage transmission. That's enough to go from New York City to to Los Angeles and back 15 times, to give you a sense of the scale for that. Right? So 75,000 miles. Now, that sounds like a lot, but it isn't impossible. In fact, we've built big things in this country all the time, right? And in fact, from the 1970s through the 1990s, we expanded the size of our US transmission grid by nearly 2% per year on a sustained basis, adding far more than that total 75,000 megawatts, or 75,000 miles. In this pathway, building that transmission expansion is an equivalent pace, about 2.3% per year expansion of our transmission grid capacity between now and 2035. So again, we have to get back to a growth mentality that, yes, we haven't seen in decades, but we have seen in the US history. This is not entirely unprecedented, nor should we consider these challenges impossible if we set our minds and our regulation and our policy to it. Now, the stakes, however, are high. Over the last decade, with relatively flat demand growth, we have only expanded grid capacity at about 1% per year, or about half of the rate that we need to be on. And we find in our transmission-constrained scenarios, we model current incentives but prevent the grid from expanding any faster than it has over this last decade, that we actually lose about half of the greenhouse gas reductions that could occur under current federal policy if we could expand the grid at the target rate. So expansion of the grid is a critical piece of the playbook along with deploying renewables. In fact, it's the critical enabler of that new supply. All right, there's just two more steps that we need to follow if we want to go from that 80 to 90% reduction to a fully carbon-free grid, which is where we need to go and where, again, I think that the state of New Jersey can lead the way. The two final steps are to demonstrate clean, firm resources at commercial scale as soon as possible, ideally in the mid to late 2020s, as is now underway. And then as these technologies become more mature and ready for large-scale deployment, scale up and transition away from our old and aging nuclear fleet, which will eventually have to be replaced, and that gas capacity that we have to maintain towards these new, reliable, carbon-free, clean energy sources. Now, we already have two of the three big pieces of the stool or the portfolio of electricity generation resources that we need for a carbon-free grid. That's fuel-saving variable renewables. That's how I describe wind and solar resources. These are technologies that are basically free when you get them, right? They have zero marginal cost or fuel cost. And so when you use wind or solar megawatt hours, you displace something with a higher marginal cost, like a fuel-consuming resource like natural gas or coal. And you avoid all the emissions of CO2 and air pollution and everything else that goes along with burning that fuel. So their value is there as in energy substitution. But of course, they're weather dependent and variable resources, and so you can't count on them to be there all the time, right? I call them reliably unreliable. You shouldn't plan on them. Grid operators don't. It's not a shock that there's a thing called nighttime or that the wind doesn't blow all the time. We know that, and we plan accordingly. But what that means is that we have to complement these resources when they're not available with other technologies. For short-term variability on the order of days or hours, we can manage with what I call fast burst or balancing resources. That includes demand flexibility, right? When do I charge my EV, or how do I pre-cool or preheat my home? It includes demand curtailment, like demand response programs at industry or aggregations of households that are willing to reduce their consumption if the price of electricity is too high or if they're paid a rebate to do so. And of course, this is where battery storage fits in. Lithium-ion batteries are cost-effective and scaling rapidly, with tens of gigawatts in the interconnection queue right now for deployment, and can provide very cost-effective shifting of supply and demand around on a sort of 4 to 10-hour duration. So that's great for diurnal cycles like solar variability and demand variability in the afternoons. What that leaves is this missing piece, which is where these firm low-carbon technologies come in. Firm resources are technologies that are available anytime you need them for as long as you need them. That makes them the critical missing ingredient in a power mix consisting of weather-dependent variable renewables and time-limited resources like batteries or demand flexibility, right? They fill the missing gap. We rely today, again, on coal or natural gas in our existing nuclear fleet for this. We are going to have to rely on those resources in the interim, again, keeping our existing nuclear foundation, keeping our gas capacity for reliability reasons, but burning less gas in those plants as we use wind and solar more, and retiring our coal fleet. But to get from 2035 on to a fully carbon-free grid, we're going to have these technologies to complement us as well. And so that includes geothermal, advanced geothermal like enhanced geothermal or closed-loop technologies. That includes advanced nuclear like small modular reactors or non-light water reactors. That includes gas or coal-fired power plants with carbon capture. Biomass-fired power plants that do emit CO2, but the CO2 came from the atmosphere and was absorbed by the plants when they grew. and net zero carbon gases, whether it's hydrogen or synthetic methane or renewable natural gas that we could burn in power plants or use in fuel cells. Fusion power, which I understand you talked about earlier today, could also fit the bill here and looks very much like a nuclear power plant. So if we can do that, we can get all the way to a carbon-free grid very cost-effectively while maintaining reliability. And in fact, public policy, again at the federal level, is helping set the stage for this kind of decarbonization. So in addition to providing subsidies to deploy wind or solar or adopt EVs, the federal policies passed, both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, provide a whole host of support to partner with the private sector to commercialize the full range of clean, firm technologies. That includes support for advanced nuclear demonstrations, $2.5 billion, nearly $10 billion for clean hydrogen demonstration programs around the country. Long-duration storage got $500 million. Carbon capture, transport, use, and storage, so the full pipeline got significant support as well. The Loan Programs Office has $40 billion in low-cost loan guarantees available for innovative technologies. And all carbon-free generation technologies, including nuclear, including advanced geothermal, as well as subsidies separately for carbon capture that can go to gas plants with CCS, all of them receive deployment subsidies at the commercial scale as well. So again, Uncle Sam is picking up a big chunk of the tab for this challenge and partnering with the private sector. And the private sector is responding. Across every one of these segments, we are seeing commercial deployment in planning right now for with first commercial demonstrations happening either right now or in the next few years across the full range of these technologies. Gas plants with carbon capture, again, projects underway now for deployment in 2025, 2026. 100% hydrogen turbines are coming to market from all of the major OEMs before 2030. Small modular reactors, multiple designs are working their way through the NRC process, with the first commercial projects coming online around 2030. Advanced geothermal projects are underway right now, with the first commercial enhanced geothermal projects under construction in Nevada and Utah and online generating power next year. And the first closed-loop geothermal projects in Europe also online next year. And low-cost, long-duration energy storage technologies that offer the potential for multi-day or seasonal storage also being commercialized, like Form Energy's iron-air technology. So, I think there's a clear playbook here. I think we've seen the policy environment fall into place over the last year. We've seen the private sector step up and respond with a range of new technologies that can help complete the toolkit. And if we put our minds to it and follow this playbook, we can meet our triple challenges of maintaining affordability, reliability, and rapidly transitioning to a carbon-free, cleaner energy system that improves public health for all of us, our kids, ourselves, and helps us confront the challenge of climate change. So this is the playbook. And I just want to close with this. There are, of course, many challenges on this path, right? Just like winning a football game is not easy, right? You can have the best playbook, you still have to execute. I know there are business leaders and political leaders and investors in this room, and I want to ask yourself, challenge yourself. Have you ever come across a challenge in your core business and simply thrown up your hands and walked away? Is that how you got to where you are today? Or did you get to where you are today by rolling up your sleeve, pulling together smart people, and tackling the challenges in front of you? That's exactly what we can do here. That's exactly what we must do if we're going to tackle climate change. Thanks.